Hi PSM, I miss you, and I was really looking forward to getting to share with you on a Sunday night, but alas, here we are. I am thankful though and grateful that we have so many different technologies that we can still stay in touch with each other, and I hope you're thankful for that too. So today I want to start by telling you a story. One day when I was about 12 years old, I was staying home alone. My parents had gone out for the night and I was home alone, and usually when I'm home alone I just veg out in front of the TV, mostly because I was too scared to walk to any other room in the house. But for this night in particular, I decided I wanted to do a favor for my mom. I decided that while my parents were gone, I was going to surprise my mom and empty the dishwasher for her. Nothing huge, I know, but I knew that my mom, her love language was acts of service, and she loved when me or my siblings would do something just out of love for her. And so I decided I was going to empty the dishwasher that night. And I was so excited as I was putting the dishes away because I was doing something that I thought would make my mom really happy and make her proud of me, because I did this act of service without her even having to ask me for it. So I put the dishes away, and then I went back to the living room and I was waiting for my parents to come home. And eventually they did. And I decided, okay, I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to let this be a surprise for my mom. And shortly after she got home, she opened up the dishwasher, sure enough, and found that it was completely empty. And so I sat there and I heard my mom say, "Who emptied the dishwasher?" And I walked into the kitchen and I was so proud of myself. I said, "It was me." And without even turning to look at me, my mom said, "The dishes were dirty." And I tell you that story not because, I tell you that story now, it's comical, but at that point in time, my heart just sunk and my 12-year-old eyes filled with tears, because I had done something that I thought was going to receive praise and approval from my mom, and instead it just made me feel like a disappointment. It made me feel rejected and isolated from her, and ultimately I was ashamed. And no worries, now this isn't a big deal. I don't feel permanently scarred for having put away the dirty dishes. But I tell you that story because I think most of us can relate to the story. I think most of us, if we are honest, if we think about our lives, we can think of a time when we have put ourselves out there and we've tried to do something that we thought would earn us praise and approval and acceptance, and instead we were just left with rejection and shame. Shame is a feeling of unworthiness or inadequacy. And sometimes we feel that way about ourselves. We think that we ourselves are unworthy or inadequate, and sometimes we think that way because we are viewing ourselves through another person's eyes. When somebody else thinks we're not cool enough, or when somebody else thinks we don't belong, we feel rejected, and that's shame. We see this pop up again over and over in the Bible. And the first place we see it is in Genesis 3, right after Adam and Eve had eaten of the fruit, right after they had sinned. It said, immediately their eyes were opened and they realized they were naked. They realized they were exposed and vulnerable. They had been naked this whole time, but it didn't matter until they sinned and they felt that shame enter in. And so immediately they began sewing fig leaves together to try to cover and hide their nakedness and their shame, which is what we often do, right? When we're ashamed, we try to cover it up and hide it from somebody, thinking that if nobody else sees it, then it's fine, then it's not there. And they hid themselves from God. And when God came walking in the garden, he saw them and he said, "Why are you hiding?" And they said, "Because we were afraid, because we were naked, and so we hid." And what we see from Genesis 3 is that right after sin entered the world, one of the major problems that it created is that it created this shameful divide between God and between man. We see that now that relationship is broken and there's shame between the two. There's broken relationship between you and God, and there's broken relationship between you and others. Shame separates us, right? So I think a lot of us, we see that shame separates us, and we know that we are seeking to fill that void in some way in our lives. And usually we seek it through the approval of others, right? With the dishwasher, I was seeking approval from my mom. But more often than not, it's bigger things. We want the approval of our parents. We want the approval of our friends and of our teachers and our coaches. And so we seek it out by performing these acts or doing these things that will make others proud of us, that will make them see us as worthy or valuable. And so we seek after academics or athletics or leadership positions, or just making more friends, or having a boyfriend or girlfriend that makes you feel loved. All these different ways that we think if we get this person's approval, if we do this thing and we get the approval, we'll fill that void. We'll make ourselves, we'll feel better, we'll feel worthy, we'll feel whole. But the problem is, it doesn't work. It doesn't last, at least. And I tell you that because I'm somebody who, when I was your age, throughout middle school and high school, I chased after all these things that I thought was going to fill that void. And the crazy thing is, I got most of them. I was the valedictorian, volleyball MVP, student body president with great friends and a boyfriend who was utterly infatuated with me. I got all these things that the world and people tell you while you're in high school is what you need to be seen as successful and worthy. I got all these things, and it felt good for like a day. But at the end of the day, when the applause wears off, I went home, and I was still left with this deep sense of shame and unworthiness for some reason. The shame that we all incurred from the fall, from sin at the very beginning. And honestly, I was depressed through most of my high school career, even though I had earned all this approval. And that grew and grew and grew. My shame grew and grew. Social researcher Brené Brown says, if you could take shame and put it in a petri dish and add silence and criticism and judgment, it would grow and grow, right? She says, when we see shame grow, we see it come out in a number of different ways in our lives. We see it come out in addictions. We realize we have the shame and this hurt, and so we find something else to numb that pain and fill that void. We see it coming out in bullying and violence. We think, if I can't feel good about myself, if I can't seek the approval of others, I'll have power over other people, I'll make other people feel smaller, and that will boost me up. We see it in depression and anxiety, right? We're overwhelmed with all the pressures of this world, or we feel lost in our ability to ever be able to get to the point that we want, to really ever feel valued and loved, and so we're depressed and we're anxious. We see it in eating disorders and having such a critical view of the way that we appear and look in another person's eyes that we go to extreme measures to control and manipulate our own body. And we see it in suicide. And finally deciding that you're so unworthy and life is so hopeless that it's better to just end it than to keep searching. In my life, it showed up in self-harm. So I told you, in high school, I had a great rap sheet, all these things that you would think would make me feel whole and worthy, yet I was depressed. And those two things didn't go together in my mind, so I felt like I couldn't talk about it to anybody else, because who was I to have the right to these feelings? I got everything I wanted and I wasn't satisfied. That would be selfish of me to share with somebody. I shouldn't feel this way, is what I thought. So I stayed silent, and I let the shame run its tapes in my mind and criticize me. And then I judged myself through self-harm. For 4 years, that shame just grew and grew and grew without any sort of healing. But eventually, the Lord took hold of my heart, and He destroyed that shame. And so I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, if we know the shame exists in our life and it's a huge problem, what do we do to combat it? What does it look like to fight back against shame? Brené Brown, the researcher that said if you put the shame in a petri dish with silence and criticism and judgment, that it grows. She said if you take that same petri dish and you put shame in it, and instead you add empathy and normalcy to that, it creates a hostile environment for shame. Shame begins to die in the presence of normalcy and empathy. And we can do that with each other. We can normalize our experience and we can empathize with each other, but it only lasts for so long. If we want to truly defeat our shame, fight back, and see it gone, we have to take it to the Lord. He's the only one who can truly empathize and normalize and take away our shame. You see, the God of the universe, He took on a normal human experience. He came in flesh and blood, clothed Himself just like you and I, but He experienced the same heartaches and the same sufferings and the same shames that you and I experience as well. If you think about Jesus and His life, you see over and over again the way He encountered shame and suffering and the way He responded to it. But I want you to focus right now. Focus on the crucifixion. When you think about the crucifixion, you see it was an excruciating, painful death for Jesus to bear. But it was incredibly humiliating and shameful as well. Even before the crucifixion even started, it said that in the Gospels it tells us that the guards took Jesus after the trial and they put this purple robe on Him. They blindfolded Him, and as a group they began beating Him and mocking Him together. They'd smack Him with a rod and yell, "Prophesy, prophesy. If you're a prophet, tell us who hit you." They'd smack Him again. "Who is that who hit you?" They mocked Him over and over again. And this should make you furious to think that somebody as highly respected and as innocent and as valuable as Jesus the King was mocked and beaten before a crowd. And then after this, after they mocked Him, it didn't stop. They hung Him up on a cross, naked, completely exposed for the world, left to die. They beat Him, and people walked by and continued to mock Him. They walked by looking up at Him saying, "Who is this, the Son of the God, King of the Jews? You saved other people, why can't you save yourself? If you're so powerful, come down off that cross." Right? He could have come down. He could have come off the cross and proven His power, proven His worth to the whole world, but instead He stayed. And He took on the full weight of humanity's shame and fallenness. He took on all of that shame, and in the crucifixion, Jesus looks at you and I and says, "Me too, I understand this. I understand your brokenness and your weight, your shame, your humiliation," because He experienced that and so much more on the cross. Hebrews 4:15 tells us, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with us in our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every respect as we are, yet without sin." One of the things that's great about going to Jesus as your Savior is that He is able to sympathize with you in your weakness. Because of His experience of life on this earth, He knows the normal human experience of shame. And He went through that too. He empathizes with you and sympathizes with you and says, I understand exactly what you're feeling. He knows who you are inside and out, but also knows how you feel inside and out, and recognizes and understands that. Jesus defeats our shame by normalizing it and empathizing with us. But he doesn't just stop there. Hebrews 4 goes on in the next verse. In verse 16, it says, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Not only does he normalize our pain and empathize with us, he then gives us grace and mercy instead. He takes away our shame, and in grace and mercy, he gives us titles of honor and respect and value. You can search all over the Bible to see the way that the Lord talks about his people. He calls us sons and daughters of the Most High God. He calls us ambassadors. He calls us co-heirs with Christ. He takes us from our shameful states and elevates us to a place of honor and value and respect. For me, I first recognized this on my first mission trip when I was 16. I saw the love that the Lord had for me and his people, and the Lord began to break down my shame. But he also pointed out to me that I'm not really seeking the approval of others. That's not really what I want. I want a life of purpose and honor. And he can give that to me. He can take away the shame that I've experienced, but then he can also invite me into the work that he is doing that is full of honor and respect and value and love. The world might not see that, but the creator of the universe recognizes that and throws that honor on top of you. Whether you earned it or not, you absolutely did not earn it. We don't have to gain the Lord's approval. He willingly gives up his honor and brings us to a place in his kingdom with him. And so, questions that I want to leave with you, PSM, are to consider some of these things. To think about, what does shame look like in your own life? What is it creating? What sort of habits or characteristics are coming out of you because you're trying to cover up shame? What would it look like to bring that to Jesus and let him empathize with you and your weaknesses? And 4, what grace and mercy have you received from the Lord that you need to remember? What titles and statuses has he just freely given to you that you need to cling to and remember? I miss you, PSM, and I love you. Remember, your shame has been destroyed. Stop seeking the approval of others and walk in a life of value and honor, love and respect that has been given to you freely in Jesus Christ.